I mentioned, are the hardcore players. Not only are they the most dedicated players, they're the ones who say they aren't going to quit. They're the ones who say they're the happiest playing, and they play more hours per week. If you see these numbers here, the women play 4 more hours a week than the men do. So much for that stereotype. Or it could be that the women are split into 2 groups, where one group tends to gravitate towards the more normative male baseline behavior, and the other group tends to gravitate towards a more standard, generic female stereotypical behavior. And I haven't done that kind of bimodal analysis on it, but that may explain some of these findings. It's just a possibility that's kind of come up recently in our thinking. Next slide. So here's an interesting way of thinking about this. We have the data on what they say they play because we asked them in a survey, but we also have data on what we know they play because we have the behavioral data, and there's a room there to look at the contrast. So the actual play was the women said 29 hours, the men said 25. Then when we asked them what they play, the women say 26, the men say 24. So a couple things pop up right away. Number one, everybody underreports how much they play. That is, if you follow the words of Gregory House, everybody lies. And there are pretty strong reasons to think that this is a social desirability lying effect here. You know, it wasn't statistical noise, it was systematically underreporting. So that suggests that they don't want to think of themselves as playing as much as they actually do for whatever reason. Maybe they, you know, it's looked down upon by their peers or the people they live with, any number of obvious stereotypical reasons here. The other interesting difference here is that the women and the men underreport at different rates. So the women, they underreport by 3 hours, and the men only underreport by 1 hour. So the underreporting is off by a factor of 3. So this suggests to me that the women, in fact, do feel somewhat bound to this stereotypical gender normative behavior where they feel the need to be more deceptive about their playing time, that is, they feel less comfortable with it than the men do. Everybody feels uncomfortable with the women, even more so than the men, apparently. So that's an interesting finding, I think, in and of itself, and a neat way of showing the value of survey data versus this unobtrusive behavioral data that we don't normally get in social science. There's some pretty strong implications here, too, though. We now know that everybody is systematically underreporting play, at least in this genre, in this kind of style. But there's pretty good reason to think that they might be underreporting play in other game research as well. So if they're underreporting, you know, 10, 15, 20% off, potentially, what that does is it potentially clouds a lot of the findings from the last 30 years of research, where if there have been findings which have been statistically significant, but just barely so, just marginally so, if these actual play numbers had been there, that would theoretically dilute a lot of effects. And or in the opposite sense, there are a lot of findings which maybe should have been significant, but weren't because the right numbers weren't used. So what we've just done is realize that we've just added a lot of noise to prior data collections, and a lot of closely significant tests in the past might now be suspect. Next slide. As I said, to be fair, including my own, I've used these measures as well. So here's an interaction effect, and without explaining the graph to you, you know that anytime you see an interaction effect when there's a crisscross, you can see that there's a big difference. What this graph shows is the behavior and the outcomes of people from the 2 genders who are playing with each other. That is to say, romantic couples who are playing EverQuest 2 together. The male line is a solid one. The male line is the dotted line, and the female line is a solid one. And on the left is a simple variable where we ask people 2 questions about happiness. How happy are you, and how many days last week were you happy? So nothing to do with the game, just life happiness. The men who played by themselves were the happier men, and the men who played with their partners were the less happy men. The finding is exactly the opposite for the women. The female players who played with a partner were the happiest females, and the players who played without them were the least happy females. So apparently what's good for the goose is not particularly good for the gander. I hesitate to make a causal inference here because this is cross-sectional data, but it does seem to suggest strongly that women really strongly prefer to play with a partner, and it might be better for them overall, and men the opposite effect. So all kinds of stereotypical behavior. And I had the pleasure of presenting this finding last Saturday at the AAAS conference in Chicago on Valentine's Day. So I made that just extra fun. Next slide. Okay, role players. Another one of these, you know, I'll give you 2 or 3 slides and it's a whole paper. These things are technically massively multiplayer online role-play games, which is to say that people theoretically are going in and taking on the role of somebody else. If you are Thundar the Viking, then you go in there and pretend you're Thundar the Viking. There are a lot of interesting theories about self-disclosure and role-play and the presentation of self, which guide this research. But the layman's version is, we're just curious how common it was, why they do it, and which kind of people are doing it. The short version is that it's not common at all, despite the fact that these are MMORPGs. Another reason why I just say MMOs, that only about 5% of the players are really strong, dedicated role players. And those dabbling in role play are really only about 15% of players. So it's this small segment of the game playing population. And it turns out they're really very different than everybody else. They're playing just a totally different game. They have a different rule set. The mainstream players are doing something else entirely, and the role players would role play anywhere they were and bring their own rules to the game. The fact that there are mechanics and dungeons and monsters and armor, it's almost immaterial for them. They're doing something else entirely. When we look at them for their profiles, we find that on every single psychological indicator we can think of, whether they had ADD, whether they had learning disability, whether they're depressed, whether they're lonely, any of those things, the role players had the worst outcomes. Well, outcomes is the wrong word because I don't want to imply causality. They had the worst profile, strikingly so. Large effects. Put these things in, use Cohen's D's. These are big effects between the different groups. So is it that playing these games in a role-playing sense gives people problems, or is it that people with problems gravitate toward the games? I think the second explanation is much more likely. I think it's unlikely that massive psychological problems and pre-existing diagnosis of ADHD would be predicted by playing a game for 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, it's certainly possible, but it seems less plausible to me. So why would these people with this baggage, really, these tough profiles, come and gravitate towards this particular game and this particular style of play? Well, one possible reason is that, number one, they might need release from difficult lives, and number two, because they come from tough backgrounds, they might not be socially accepted. Evidence of that would be if they, in addition to having all these problems, were also from relatively marginalized groups in society. So my hypothesis going in was, well, okay, if that's true, then the role players should skew to be people who are outside of mainstream groups on kind of basic demographic patterns. Number one, they should be from racial minorities more often. Number two, they should be from non-mainstream religions or even be agnostic. And number three, they should be from a non-mainstream sexuality, so they should be more likely to be bisexual and homosexual, or androgynous or declined state, or any of the other variables we have. So if that's the case, we should see a skew like that. Next slide. I'll let you guys absorb this, but that's exactly what we find. That's exactly what these data show on the chart. Along the bottom of the chart, I've split the sample into low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity role players across all the people in our sample. This is about 7,000 people. And as you can see, the high role players are much likely to be from an ethnic minority, to be non-heterosexual, and to be from a non-mainstream faith group. And the low role players, by contrast, are from these more mainstream groups. So the marginalized populations are much more likely to role play. I think this lends credence to the hypothesis that these folks are not accepted as well in their daily lives, and this is a place where they can go to A, be accepted, and B, experiment with their identity if they aren't sure about it. Both things, I think, are potential. The other thing we did in this particular study was, just so you guys know, we did an ethnographic component to this as well. Since we have all these survey and behavioral data, we went in and talked to the role players and asked them questions about the place of the game in their daily lives. And that's in fact what most of them said. They're highly aware of the negative stereotypes around their play. Most of them are doing it for therapeutic or creative reasons. A lot of them spoke about their inability to connect with people offline and how the game worked as an outlet. A very common anecdote that we've heard, and again, the generalizability issue here, was that because of serious psychological problems or physical problems, they were unable to have strong social lives offline, and this was their really only viable outlet. You could, of course, counter that by having this outlet, it makes them not go out and try in the real world as much, and so maybe they're at more of a risk for being socially isolated where it truly quote unquote counts.